All right. Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. This is going to be episode 22, I believe. Oh, excuse me. It's a little chilly outside tonight. The weather got me feeling a little tired. But I got a coffee next to me. We gonna push through. We are reading Race Matters by Dr. Cornel West. We are on the introduction. Here. All right, give me 1 second, y'all. It's gotta switch to get these gloves right. So they did this before I started. All right. Sorry about that, y'all. Sorry about that. I could start it over, but I just started one over that I did. I want to start it over. All right. Page 6. What is to be done? How do we capture a new spirit and vision to meet the challenges of the post-industrial city, postmodern culture, and post-party politics? First, we must admit that the most valuable sources for help, hope, and power consist of ourselves and our common history. As in the ages of Lincoln, Roosevelt, and King, we must look to new frameworks and languages to understand our multi-layered crisis and overcome our deep malaise. Second, we must focus our attention on the public square, the common good that undergirds our national and global destinies. The vitality of any public square ultimately depends on how much we care about the quality of our lives together. The neglect of our public infrastructure, for example, our water and sewer systems, bridges, tunnels, highways, subways, and streets, reflects not only our myopic economic policies, which impede productivity, but also the low priority we place on our common life. The tragic plight of our children clearly reveals our deep disregard for public well-being. About 1 out of every 5 children in this country lives in poverty, including 1 out of every 2 black children and 2 out of every 5 Hispanic children. Most of our children, neglected by overburdened parents and bombarded by the market values of profit-hungry corporations, are ill-equipped to live lives of spiritual and cultural quality. Faced with these facts, how do we expect ever to constitute a vibrant society? One essential step is some form of large-scale public intervention to ensure access to basic social goods, housing, food, health care, education, child care, and jobs. We must invigorate the common good with a mixture of government, business, and labor that does not follow any existing blueprint. After a period in which the private sphere has been sacralized and the public square gutted, the temptation is to make a fetish of the public square. We need to resist such dogmatic swings. Last, the major challenge is to meet the need to generate new leadership. The paucity of courageous leaders, so apparent in the response to the events in Los Angeles, requires that we look beyond the same elites and voices that recycle the old frameworks. We need leaders, neither saints nor sparkling television personalities, who can situate themselves within the large historical narrative of this country and our world, who can grasp the complex dynamics of our peoplehood and imagine a future grounded in the best of our past, yet who are attuned to the frightening obstacles that now perplex us. Our ideals of freedom, democracy, and equality must be invoked to invigorate all of us, especially the landless, propertyless, and luckless. Only a visionary leadership that can motivate, quote, the better angles of our nature, end quote, as Lincoln said, and activate possibilities for a freer, more efficient, and stable America, only that leadership deserves cultivation and support. This new leadership must be grounded in grassroots organizing that highlights democratic accountability. Whoever our leaders will be as we approach the 21st century, Their challenge will be to help Americans determine whether a genuine multiracial democracy can be created and sustained in an era of global economy and a moment of xenophobic frenzy. Let us hope and pray that the vast intelligence, imagination, humor, and courage of Americans will not fail us. Either we learn a new language of empathy and compassion, or the fire this time will consume us all. And that brings us to the end of the introduction. The first thing that stands out to me from the passage we just read there is the cry for leadership that Cornel West is putting out. And I think that that's something that has been apparent specifically here in Rockford as well, where it's clear that the people that have once been paraded out as leaders, or the people that the power structures or the political system would like to call leaders or would give the title to leader to, are not people who are leading in thought or leading in action. They are people who are just in positions that have the connotation of leadership next to them. And this Cornel West was the first person I heard say this, and ever since the first time I've heard it, it's stuck with me. But we need leaders who are thermostats and not leaders who are simply thermometers. We need leaders who can check what the temperature of the room is and can tell you what the temperature is in the room, but can also adjust the temperature of the room and are willing to take the chance of adjusting the temperature in the room like a thermostat, as opposed to having leaders who are just thermometers who can only tell you what the temperature in the room is, but they cannot change the temperature in the room. They have no interest or no desire or don't have the capabilities to attempt to try to change the temperature in the room. And so that is a separate type of leaders. We need leaders who challenge the status quo that oppress and exploit people, not leaders who maintain the status quo that oppress and exploit people. And so that's one of the things, the first things or the main things that sticks out to me from that passage. And I think that, again, the cultural element that Cornel West puts on these things is important. Okay, as we move on to the next passage, we begin Chapter 1, Nihilism in Black America. We black folk, our history and our present being, are a mirror of all the many-fold experiences of America. What we want, what we represent, what we endure is what America is. If we black folk perish, America will perish. If America has forgotten her past, then let her look into the mirror of our consciousness and she will see the living past living in the present. For our memories go back through our black folk of today, through the recollections of our black parents, and through the tales of slavery told by our black grandparents, to the time when none of us, black or white, lived in this fertile land. The differences between black folk and white folk are not blood or color, and the ties that bind us are deeper than those that separate us. The common road of hope which we all traveled has brought us into a stronger kinship than any words, laws, or legal claims. Richard Wright, 12 Million Black Voices, 1941. Recent discussions about the plight of African Americans, especially those at the bottom of the social ladder, tend to divide into two camps. On the one hand, there are those who highlight the structural constraints on the life chances of black people. Their viewpoint involves a subtle historical and sociological analysis of slavery, Jim Crowism, job and residential discrimination, skewed unemployment rates, inadequate health care, and poor education. On the other hand, there are those who stress the behavioral impediments on black upward mobility. They focus on the waning of the Protestant ethic, hard work, deferred gratification, frugality, and responsibility in much of black America. Those in the first camp, the liberal structuralists, call for full employment, health, education, and child care programs, and broad affirmative action practices. In short, a new, more sober version of the best of the New Deal in the Great Society. More government money, better bureaucrats, and an active citizenry. Those in the second camp, the conservative behaviorists, promote self-help programs, black business expansion, and non-preferential job practices. They support vigorous, quote, free market, end quote, strategies that depend on fundamental changes in how black people act and live. To put it bluntly, sorry, I was changing the page. To put it bluntly, their projects rest largely upon a cultural revival of the Protestant ethic in black America. Unfortunately, these two camps have nearly suffocated the crucial debate that should be taking place about the prospects for black America. This debate must go far beyond the liberal and conservative positions in three fundamental ways. First, we must acknowledge that structures and behavior are inseparable, that institutions and values go hand in hand. How people act and live are shaped, though in no way dictated or determined, by the larger circumstances in which they find themselves. These circumstances can be changed, their limits annotated, but by positive actions to elevate living conditions. Second, we must reject the idea that structures are primarily economic and political creatures, an idea that sees culture as an ephemeral set of behavioral attitudes and values. Culture is as much a structure as the economy or politics. It is rooted in institutions such as families, schools, churches, synagogues, mosques, and communication industries, television, radio, video, music. Similarly, the economy and politics are not only influenced by values, but also promote particular cultural ideas of the good life and good society. Third, and most important, we must delve into the depths where neither liberals nor conservatives dare to tread, namely into the murky waters of despair and dread that now flood the streets of black America, to talk about the depressing statistics of unemployment, infant mortality, incarceration, teenage pregnancy, and violent crime is one thing, but to face up to the monumental eclipse of hope, the unprecedented collapse of meaning, the incredible disregard for human, especially black, life and property in much of black America is something else. The liberal/conservative discussion conceals the most basic issue now facing black America, the nihilistic threat to its very existence. This threat is not simply a matter of relative economic deprivation and political powerlessness, though economic well-being and political clout are requisites for meaningful black progress. It is primarily a question of speaking to the profound sense of psychological depression, personal worthlessness, and social despair so widespread in black America. The liberal structuralists failed to grapple with this threat for two reasons. First, their focus on structural constraints relates almost exclusively to the economy and politics. They show no understanding of the structural character of culture. Why? Because they tend to view people in egoistic and rationalist terms according to which they are motivated primarily by self-interest and self-preservation. Needless to say, this is partly true about most of us. Yet, people, especially degraded and oppressed people, are also hungry for identity, meaning, and self-worth. The second reason liberal structuralists overlook the nihilistic threat is a sheer failure of nerve. They hesitate to talk honestly about culture, the realm of meanings and values, because doing so seems to lend itself too readily to conservative conclusions in the narrow way Americans discuss race. If there is a hidden taboo among liberals, it is to resist talking too much about values, because such discussions remove the focus from structures and especially because they obscure the positive role of government. But this failure by liberals leaves the existential and psychological realities of black people in the lurch. In this way, liberal structuralists neglect the battered identities rampant in black America. As for the conservative behaviorists, they not only misconstrue the nihilistic threat, but inadvertently contribute to it. This is a serious charge, and it rests upon several claims. Conservative behaviorists talk about values and attitudes as if political and economic structures hardly exist. They rarely, if ever, examine the innumerable cases in which black people do act on a Protestant ethic and still remain at the bottom of the social ladder. Instead, they highlight the few instances in which blacks ascend to the top, as if such success is available to all blacks, regardless of circumstances. Such a vulgar rendition of Horatio Alger in blackface may serve as a source of inspiration to some, a kind of model for those who already are on the right track. But it cannot serve as a substitute for serious historical and social analysis of the predicaments of and prospects for all black people, especially the grossly disadvantaged ones. Conservative behaviorists also discuss black culture as if acknowledging one's obvious victimization by white supremacist practices, compounded by sexism and class condition, is taboo. They tell black people to see themselves as agents, not victims. And on the surface, this is comforting advice, a nice cliche for downtrodden people. But inspirational slogans cannot substitute for substantive historical and social analysis. While black people have never been simply victims, wallowing in self-pity and begging for white giveaways, they have been and are victimized. Therefore, to call on black people to be agents makes sense only if we also examine the dynamics of this victimization against which their agency will, in part, be exercised. What is particularly naive and peculiarly vicious about the conservative behavioral outlook is that it tends to deny the lingering effect of black history, a history inseparable from, though not reducible to, victimization. In this way, crucial and indispensable themes of self-help and personal responsibility are wrenched out of historical context and contemporary circumstances as if it is all a matter of personal will. This ahistorical perspective contributes to the nihilistic threat within black America in that it can be used to justify the right-wing cutbacks for poor people struggling for decent housing, child care, health care, and education. As I pointed out above, the liberal perspective is deficient in important ways, but even so, liberals are right on target in their critique of conservative government cutbacks for services to the poor. These ghastly cutbacks are one cause of the nihilist threat to black America. And then that brings us to the end of that passage in Chapter 1, Nihilism in Black America. I think one of the first things that comes to mind is the continuing, which is, sorry about that. One of the first things that come to mind for me in this passage is Cornel West continuing to dissect and diagnose and have dialogue about conservatives and liberals, and to dive into their thinking and their way of thinking and critique their ideology and critique their policy and their beliefs. And I think that is something that we have to be able to do. I remember asking last year when I began to get more involved or become involved in the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, slowly trying to learn more about electoral politics and learn more about Democrats and Republicans. And I remember trying to find out what the difference between the definition of a liberal is, or what a liberal was, what a neoliberal was, what conservatives were, and talking to Terry and talking to Antar and talking to different people assisted with that. But one of the things that helped also a lot was listening to Cornel West and reading Cornel West. And I think that Cornel West does a good job of diagnosing the political parties and the sub-parties within the political parties that exist in the country. And so the diagnosis he gives to conservatives, which you can be I think you could be considered a Democratic conservative and or more liberal leaning Republican, but the diagnosis that I believe that he gives to conservatives and to conservatives and liberals is very necessary, and I think that it helps to sort of define what they are and sort of define their way of thinking, and so that's the first thoughts that I come away with, and again, I think that the culture aspect that Cornel West speaks about is one that is necessary and is needed, and I think that we have to find ways to be able to not only talk about the institutional issues that we are facing, but also the cultural issues that we're facing, and what those cultural issues where they stem from. And I think that when he talks about one of the things he did is he talked about that music and movies and entertainment also play a role within creating culture, and that also institutions play a role within creating culture. Communication industries is what he said. This is the sentence. Culture is as much a structure as the economy or politics. It is rooted in institutions such as families, schools, churches, synagogues, mosques, and communication industries such as television, radio, video, and music. And so I think that that's another one of the things that was important for me to touch on and to speak on, or important for us to touch on and to speak on when it comes to these the cultural aspect, which Cornel West is touching on within Race Matters. And again, I think that that's one of the most distinct differences between Race Matters and the book we read previously, Have Black Lives Ever Mattered, is that Mumia Abu-Jamal wasn't really dissecting the culture of Black America as much as he was dissecting the issues that are confronting Black America in the realm of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. I think we should be able to finish through this chapter, so let's keep on reading. One second. All right. The proper starting point for the crucial debate about the prospects for Black America is an examination of the nihilism that increasingly pervades Black communities. Nihilism is to be understood here not as a philosophical doctrine that there are no rational grounds for legitimate standards or authority. It is, far more, the lived experience of coping with the life of horrifying meaninglessness, hopelessness, and most important, lovelessness. The frightening result is a numbing detachment from others and a self-destructive disposition toward the world. Life without meaning, hope, and love breeds a cold-hearted, mean-spirited outlook that destroys both the individual and others. Nihilism is not new in Black America. The first African encounter with the New World was an encounter with a distinctive form of the absurd. The initial Black struggle against degradation and devaluation in the enslaved circumstances of the New World was, in part, a struggle against nihilism. In fact, the major enemy of Black survival in America has been and is neither oppression nor exploitation, but rather the nihilistic threat, that is, loss of hope and absence of meaning. For as long as hope remains and meaning is preserved, the possibility of overcoming oppression stays alive. The self-fulfilling prophecy of the nihilistic threat is that without hope there can be no future, that without meaning there can be no struggle. The genius of our Black foremothers and forefathers was to create powerful buffers to ward off the nihilistic threat, to equip Black folk with cultural armor to beat back the demons of hopelessness, meaninglessness, and lovelessness. These buffers consisted of cultural structures of meaning and feeling that created and sustained communities. This armor constituted ways of life and struggle that embodied values of service and sacrifice, love and care, discipline and excellence. In other words, traditions for Black surviving and thriving under usually adverse New World conditions were major barriers against the nihilistic threat. These traditions consist primarily of Black religious and civic institutions that sustain familial and communal networks of support. If cultures are, in part, what human beings create out of antecedent fragments of other cultures, in order to convince themselves not to commit suicide, then Black foremothers and forefathers are to be applauded. In fact, until the early 70s, Black Americans had the lowest suicide rate in the United States. But now young Black people lead the nation in suicides. What has changed? What went wrong? The bitter irony of integration? The cumulative effects of a genocidal conspiracy? The virtual collapse of rising expectations after the optimistic 60s? None of us fully understands why the cultural structures that once sustained Black life in America are no longer able to fend off the nihilistic threat. I believe that two significant reasons why the threat is more powerful now than ever before are the saturation of market forces and market moralities in black life and the present crisis in black leadership. The recent market-driven shattering of black civil society, that being black families, black neighborhoods, black schools, black churches, black mosques, leaves more and more black people vulnerable to daily lives endured with little sense of self and fragile existential moorings. Black people have always been in America's wilderness in search of a promised land. Yet many black folk now reside in a jungle ruled by a cutthroat market morality devoid of any faith in deliverance or hope for freedom. Contrary to the superficial claims of the conservative behaviorist, these jungles are not primarily the result of pathological behavior. Rather, this behavior is the tragic response of a people bereft of resources in confronting the workings of U.S. capitalist society. Saying this is not the same as asserting that individual black people are not responsible for their actions. Black murderers and rapists should go to jail. But it must be recognized that the nihilistic threat contributes to criminal behavior. It is a threat that feeds on poverty and shattered cultural institutions and grows more powerful as the armors to ward against it are weakened. And then that's going to get us close to the 30-minute mark. But I want to reflect on that. That's the end of another passage. I think that another one of the things that stands out to me about this chapter in Race Matters is this was the most I had ever heard the word nihilism used, or the concept of nihilism being attributed this heavily to black culture and black society. Forced me to even go back and reacquaint myself with the definition of nihilism and the concept of nihilism. And I think that the way that because of the fact that Cornel West is constantly finding ways to weave the culture of black America and the culture of American society into the conversation about where we stand in the society and how the reflection these institutions have on us, it gets us into a place of diving deeper into certain things. And so I think that when he talks about why has the suicide rate in the nation and black people risen, and then he gives a couple of things that could be possibilities when he talks about the irony of integration, and I think that one of the things in the previous pretext he talked about happening at the same time of integration was at the same time black people were accepted into the mainstream society, that the mainstream society began to be more commercialized. It began to be more market driven, that at the same time that black people were beginning to be part of the mainstream society, that the mainstream society began to involve mass incarcerating people in the country. It began to involve the spreading of the imperialism, specifically, is what he talks about. And so even though black people were integrated into the society and token integration in small parts, the type of society that they were brought into was not a healthy one. And then when he talks about, is it the cumulative effects of a genocidal conspiracy? And when you look back at the black existence in this country, the phrase genocidal conspiracy is something that is a specter over every period of time black people have existed here, whether that be crack cocaine being conspired to be put in black neighborhoods, whether that be factories being that was be negative for the environment being conspired to be put in black neighborhoods, or faulty water like in Flint with the issues going on in the water there. And so this idea of genocidal conspiracy is something that has always, Tuskegee experiment, all of these things, there's always been concepts of genocidal conspiracy that have lingered over black people. The collapse of rising expectations after the optimistic 60s, when you think about Richard Nixon coming into office, and you think about Ronald Reagan and Reaganomics and the cutbacks that they did to some of the things that were gained in the 60s, and the negative effects that those had, and the criminalization of black life, and how you couldn't it stopped being about segregation and started being about incarceration, and all of these things Cornell West diagnoses the cultural aspect and the cultural dangers or the cultural impacts that those things had on Black America. And I think that is something, especially within when we're talking to other people in the Black American culture, that is something that is important for us to be able to dissect. And he talks about how and earlier on in this chapter, how one of the faults of the liberals that exist is that they weren't willing to have those type of conversations, and that when the conservatives had the conversations, they had them from a biased and a prejudiced standpoint. And what's needed is for it to be a honest, transparent conversation about how the institutional evils of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice have led to cultural degradation, or has led to had a negative cultural impact on the Black American society. Let me see where we at on here. I want to try to get through these chapters. I feel like unless I take one of these and get through the chapter, we're going to continuously be like ending one chapter and starting another one on the same one. All right, so let's try to get through this chapter. But why is this shattering of Black civil society occurring? What has led to the weakening of Black cultural institutions in asphalt jungles? Corporate market institutions have contributed greatly to their collapse. By corporate market institutions, I mean that complex set of interlocking enterprises that have a disproportionate amount of capital, power, and exercise a disproportionate influence on how our society is run and how our culture is shaped. Needless to say, the primary motivation of these institutions is to make profits, and their basic strategy is to convince the public to consume. These institutions have helped create a seductive way of life, a culture of consumption that capitalizes on every opportunity to make money. Market calculations and cost-benefit analyses hold sway in almost every sphere of U.S. society. The common denominator of these calculations and analyses is usually the provision, expansion, and intensification of pleasure. Pleasure is a multivalent term. It means different things to many people. In the American way of life, pleasure involves comfort, convenience, and sexual stimulation. Pleasure, so defined, has little to do with the past and views the future as no more than a repetition of a hedonistically driven present. This market morality stigmatizes others as objects for personal pleasure or bodily stimulation. Conservative behaviorists have alleged that traditional morality has been undermined by radical feminists and the cultural radicals of the 60s. But it is clear that corporate market institutions have greatly contributed to undermining traditional morality in order to stay in business and make a profit. The reduction of individuals to objects of pleasure is especially evident in the cultural industries, television, radio, video, music, in which gestures of sexual foreplay and orgiastic pleasure flood the marketplace. Like all Americans, African Americans are influenced greatly by the images of comfort, convenience, machismo, femininity, violence, and sexual stimulation that bombard consumers. These seductive images contribute to the predominance of the market-inspired way of life over all others and thereby edge out non-market values, love, care, service to others, handed down by preceding generations. The predominance of this way of life among those living in poverty-ridden conditions, with the limited capacity to ward off self-contempt and self-hatred, results in the possible triumph of the nihilistic threat in Black America. And then I think we're going to start a new passage here. I know that's not real. It's a quick turnaround to dissect. But I think that's one of the things that we see here in Rockford and we see in the nation, where black people are putting and have put not just simply electoral politics, but also finances and how much money that they can make or how much money something can be worth ahead of integrity or ahead of ideology or belief system. And it's not about trying to further black people as a whole. It's about trying to further yourself as a black person, and then hoping that the pedestal or the platform that you have can be used to inspire other black people to excel or to exceed. But that doesn't do anything to address the fact of the black people who will never be able to excel or exceed as long as these hindrances are up that only allow for one or two black people to have strong economic gain or have some type of strong financial gain. And so as a people, what is the set of beliefs, or what is the priority, what the priority is for mainstream America can't be the same priorities for black America, because the priorities of mainstream America keep black America subjugated and keep black America oppressed, keep black America exploited. And so those are some of the things that I get directly from the passage that we read there. A major contemporary strategy for holding the nihilistic threat at bay is a direct attack on the sense of worthlessness and self-loathing in black America. This angst resembles a kind of collective clinical depression in significant pockets of black America. The eclipse of hope and collapse of meaning in much of black America is linked to the structural dynamics of corporate market institutions that affect all Americans. Under these circumstances, black existential angst derives from the lived experience of ontological wounds and emotional scars inflicted by white supremacist beliefs and images permeating U.S. society and culture. These belief and images attack black intelligence, black ability, black beauty, and black character daily in subtle and not so subtle ways. Toni Morrison's novel, The Bluest Eye, for example, reveals the devastating effect of pervasive European ideals of beauty on the self-image of young black women. Morrison's exposure of the harmful extent to which these white ideals affect the black self-image is a first step toward rejecting these ideals and overcoming the nihilistic self-loathing they engender in blacks. The accumulated effect of the black wounds and scars suffered in a white-dominated society is a deep-seated anger, a boiling sense of rage, and a passionate pessimism regarding America's will to justice. Under conditions of slavery and Jim Crow segregation, this anger, rage, and pessimism remained relatively muted because of a well-justified fear of brutal white retaliation. The major breakthroughs of the 60s, more physically than politically, swept this fear away. Sadly, the combination of the market way of life, poverty-ridden conditions, black existential angst, and the lessening of fear of white authorities has directed most of the anger, rage, and despair toward fellow black citizens, especially toward black women who are the most vulnerable in our society and in black communities. Only recently has this nihilistic threat and its ugly, inhumane outlook and actions surfaced in the larger American society, and its appearance surely reveals one of the many instances of cultural decay in a declining empire. What is to be done about this nihilistic threat? Is there really any hope, given our shattered civil society, market-driven corporate enterprises, and white supremacism? If one begins with the threat of concrete nihilism, then one must talk about some kind of politics of conversion. New models of collective black leadership must promote a version of this politics. Like alcoholism and drug addiction, nihilism is a disease of the soul. It can never be completely cured, and there is always the possibility of relapse. But there is always a chance for conversion, a chance for people to believe that there is hope for the future and a meaning to struggle. This chance rests neither on an agreement about what justice consists of, nor on an analysis of how racism, sexism, or class subordination operate. Such arguments and analyses are indispensable. But a politics of conversion requires more. Nihilism is not overcome by arguments or analyses. It is tamed by love and care. Any disease of the soul must be conquered by a turning of one's soul. This turning is done through one's own affirmation of one's worth, an affirmation fueled by the concern of others. A love ethic must be at the center of politics of conversion. A love ethic has nothing to do with sentimental feelings or tribal connections. Rather, it is a last attempt at generating a sense of agency among a downtrodden people. The best exemplar of this love ethic is depicted on a number of levels in Toni Morrison's great novel, Beloved. Self-love and love of others are both modes toward increasing self-valuation and encouraging political resistance in one's community. These modes of valuation and resistance are rooted in a subversive memory, the best of one's past without romantic nostalgia, and guided by a universal love ethic. For my purposes here, beloved can be construed as bringing together the loving yet critical affirmation of black humanity found in the best of black nationalist movements, the perennial hope against hope for transracial coalition and progressive movements, and the painful struggle for self-affirming sanity in a history in which the nihilistic threat seems insurmountable. The politics of conversion proceeds principally on the local level, in those institutions and civil society still vital enough to promote self-worth and self-affirmation. It surfaces on the state and national levels only when grassroots democratic organizations put forward a recollective leadership that has earned the love and respect of, and, most important, has proved itself accountable to these organizations. This collective leadership must exemplify moral integrity, character, and democratic statesmanship within itself and within its organizations. Like liberal structuralists, the advocates of a politics of conversion never lose sight of the structural conditions that shape the sufferings and lives of people. Yet, unlike liberal structuralism, the politics of conversion meets the nihilistic threat head on. Like conservative behaviorism, the politics of conversion openly confronts the self-destructive and inhumane actions of black people. Unlike conservative behaviorists, the politics of conversion situates these actions within inhumane circumstances, but does not thereby exonerate them. The politics of conversion shuns the limelight, a limelight that solicits statue seekers and ingratiates egomaniacs. Excuse me. Cornel West will have you doing that, though. Instead, it stays on the ground among the toiling everyday people, ushering forth humble freedom fighters, both followers and leaders, who have the audacity to take the nihilistic threat by the neck and turn back its deadly assaults. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 1, Nihilism in Black America. I know this is going to make us a little bit longer than, have us running a little bit over 30 minutes, but I wanted to try to see if we can just have each one of these episodes be a chapter, and that wasn't going to happen unless we got a full chapter in. So we got that full first chapter in and the end of the introduction in on this episode. Again, this whole chapter was about nihilism in Black America. I think that I know that some of the ways that Cornel West frames things very, very philosophical in his writing, so I'm not sure. I hope that everybody could follow with everything. And but my main takeaway from the entirety of that chapter, not just the last section that we read, but the full chapter, is the importance of having a conversation about where Black America currently sits in the American society based off of the totality of the Black American existence in this country, from the first time that an African was enslaved and came over here in indentured servitude and was not allowed to be freed, to the most recent person that's been murdered by police, to the most recent person that's been falsely arrested and imprisoned, to the most recent person who has been denied a job because of their skin color. And in doing that and taking all of those things into totality, speaking about the cultural ramifications that those things have had, along with speaking about the financial ramifications and the educational ramifications, and how all of these different institutional ramifications have contributed to the cultural decay that exists in some aspects of Black American society. And to reference back to something that Cornel West did in the introduction, he spoke about the black music and the importance of black music. And I think that even though it may not be the same form of music, it may not be Cornel West generation of music, I think you can listen to the music that exists that comes from Black people in in America, and you can hear the nihilism that is inside the lyrics, and you can hear the effects that police terrorism and mass incarceration and racial injustice have had on 20-year-old black people, on black people that are teenagers, and even 30s, 40s if you go address these, date these things further back. And so I think that we have to begin to have genuine conversations about those ramifications. Begin to, from those conversations, go further than just talking about them, and begin to start rebuilding some of the parts of the black culture that have suffered from this capitalistic society, and that have suffered from the imperialism that America has wrought in the past 50, 60, 70 years. So as we finish up this episode, I want to, we have about 45 minutes. I want to ask people to go back and listen to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily. And if there's any more episodes that's out, please go and listen to those. Share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Remember, The Social Construct of Leslie comes out on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Leaderless by Ari Perez has episodes out on the May 30th Alliance Podcast Network, so go and listen to those. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, on Instagram, subscribe to us on YouTube, and look out for the next episode of Rockford Reading Daily. We'll start Chapter 2 of Race Matters. All right, we outside.